I am a 25-year-old woman with a sister who is 3 years younger than me. My 22-year-old sister is currently 6 months pregnant. We were raised by our mother alone after losing our father when I was 14. Life when my father was alive was something we could manage to get through. My mother clearly favored my sister, and my father, noticing this, tried to bridge the gap by supporting me. Just as my sister was precious to my mother, I was special to my father. After my father passed away, the balance within our family was further disrupted. Although we had grandparents, they didn't live with us and were not deeply involved in our daily lives. Moreover, my father's parents had already passed away when he was young, so we had little connection to his side of the family. My maternal grandparents visited often and we spent time together, but they never lived with us. My mother clearly told her parents that she wanted to live only with her children. While she didn't mind occasional visits, she was against living together with them. This stemmed from my mother's desire to maintain her independence and freedom. However, she couldn't claim to be truly independent as she was still relying on financial support from her parents. My father was a veterinarian and financially well off, so my mother stopped working after giving birth to us. After my father's death, my mother got a sales job through my grandfather's connections, and I thought she supported the household on her own. But I recently discovered that she had been receiving financial help from my grandfather all along. It feels contradictory that she rejected living together with them while readily accepting money from them. After my father's death, my mother treated me coldly. I always felt emotionally distanced and isolated, yet I was not allowed to leave the house. Moving in with my grandparents was an option, but I don't think my mother would have permitted it. When that thought crossed my mind and I blamed my mother's attitude, her affection turned entirely toward my sister. During arguments, when I said, "I'll live with my grandparents," my mother emotionally manipulated me. Being young at the time, I ended up staying under her control. That period was truly painful. Not only did my mother favor my sister, but my sister was aware of it and often took advantage of the situation. Whenever something went wrong, I was always the one blamed, while my sister escaped any punishment. The treatment we received as siblings was completely different. I think this is why she developed a completely different personality from mine. When I graduated from college and got my first job, I finally felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. I was earning my own income and no longer needed to live with my mother. As soon as I saved enough money, I moved out of my family home. Since then, I've kept my distance from my family and have truly enjoyed the freedom. For the past 2 years, I've been living with Andrew, whom I met during my university days. We started dating a while ago and decided to live together 2 years ago. He was truly my life partner. We got married about 3 weeks ago, but sadly I lost him just a few days later. He died in a work-related accident. It's still painful to talk about, but it was a completely unexpected tragedy, and I still can't come to terms with it. There is no doubt that he was an irreplaceable presence in my life and my soulmate. Because of that, I can't even imagine living without him. Losing him just as we decided to walk through life together feels like my heart is being torn apart. It is truly unbearable pain. My mother has been there for me, visiting my home every day after the funeral, which has been a great help. However, I had no idea that she had something important to ask of me. About a week ago, my mother visited me. After some casual conversation, she brought up the main topic. She asked if my pregnant sister could live in my house now that Andrew is gone. My sister is unmarried but is pregnant with her boyfriend's child. She had been living with my mother, but as the baby's due date approaches, she has started to consider living with her boyfriend. It would be more convenient for them to live together. However, she had already set her sights on my home and showed no intention of finding a new place. My house is conveniently located near her boyfriend's workplace, the neighborhood has a good reputation, and the mortgage is not prohibitively expensive. To be honest, it's an ideal location for them, and I can understand why my sister likes the house. It seemed she had decided this house was perfect from the moment she decided to live with her boyfriend. Although she intended to talk to me about it, she hesitated due to Andrew's death, unsure of the timing. Recently, my mother and sister discussed how Andrew's absence left enough space in the house. They thought that if I was willing, I could allow them to stay with me until I found a new home. That being said, they seemed eager to move in as soon as possible. According to my mother, my sister and her boyfriend assumed I would easily agree to give up the house. Moreover, the way they phrased it made it sound as if letting them move in, while I stayed here grieving, was somehow a favor to me. The fact that they didn't approach me directly and instead had my mother deliver the request was infuriating enough. On top of that, they tried to justify the idea by claiming the house now had extra space since my husband was gone. It was an incredibly insensitive thought, one that no reasonable person would even consider voicing. When my mother brought up the topic, I was dumbfounded. I had believed that she was looking after me out of genuine care and concern. But in that moment, I realized she had been watching over me only to advance this plan. I was deeply angry, but I tried not to show it. Calmly, I asked my mother why my sister and her boyfriend hadn't approached me directly. She replied that they felt my sister was too exhausted from her pregnancy to have a serious conversation with me. She also explained that they understood the request was complicated to bring up. I then asked why they assumed it was natural for me to give up my house. My mother answered that she had simply expected me to agree without questioning it. As I pondered this, my mother added that she and my sister thought it would be emotionally difficult for me to continue living in the house full of memories of Andrew. Hearing this deeply pained me. I felt that my mother's explanation was nothing more than an excuse. In reality, I realized they were simply being self-centered, assuming I would naturally accept their wishes. Even so, I calmly told her, I have no intention of accepting that proposal, and made it clear that I intended to stay in this house. This house is a precious place for me. I expected some argument, but my mother said nothing and left. I thought they had understood, but I was wrong. The next day, my mother came back, this time with my sister. They said I was still struggling to come to terms with my husband's death. However, my sister insisted that my house was truly the ideal place for her to live with her boyfriend. She claimed that, despite being mentally and physically exhausted, she had come all this way to convey this to me. She desperately wanted to move into this house. Then, she told me that I didn't have to leave the house. She proposed that we could share it together instead. Without pausing to consider how insensitive they were, they went on about how she was looking forward to enjoying things like playing sports with her boyfriend under the same roof. Additionally, they mentioned their plan to get married after the baby was born, claiming they needed this house and my support. She continued trying to convince me, using her pregnancy as a reason, but it was utterly absurd. Despite the fact that I was still grieving the loss of my husband, they seemed completely devoid of any consideration for my feelings. Lacking the energy to argue further, I reiterated that I had no intention of leaving this house anytime soon. I explained that I was still processing my emotions and had many procedures to handle. However, instead of respecting my opinion, they expressed their dissatisfaction and said, "You're so selfish, but we'll be back," before leaving. I was surprised, but I didn't have the energy to argue, so I left it alone. However, a few days later, my sister and her boyfriend suddenly showed up at my house. They came with large bags in tow, boldly entered, and made themselves at home without permission. They simply said, "We'll be living here starting today." I was stunned. Despite my refusal, they brought their belongings without my consent. Moreover, my sister had made a spare key without my permission and had moved their things in while I was away. When I learned this, I was at a loss for words. They acted as if they were the rightful owners of the house. I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to have my pregnant sister arrested, so I decided to take another approach. I had a lawyer prepare documents that appeared similar to a standard rental agreement, but included ownership transfer clauses. My sister, who was unwell due to her pregnancy, didn't carefully review the contents of the document. She asked, "This is just our rental agreement, right?" I didn't answer clearly and only nodded vaguely. Without reading the fine print, she and her boyfriend signed the documents. The document contained terms related to a rental agreement, but also included clauses about assuming the mortgage debt and transferring ownership of the property. As a result, they signed a legally binding contract. After that, I packed my belongings and left, allowing them to use the house. This wasn't out of kindness, but because I knew they would continue causing problems until I agreed. It was a measure to avoid further conflict. There were other ways I could have defended the house, but honestly, I didn't have the energy to pursue them. The main reason, however, was that I planned to sell the house within a few months. Since losing Andrew, I had been planning to move to another state, so there was no reason for me to stay. I started looking for jobs out of state. I could have revoked the rental agreement and evicted them out of spite, but in the end, I didn't. I was already in a difficult situation myself, so I chose to avoid further trouble. I considered staying in a hotel temporarily, but with so much luggage, I decided to visit my grandfather's house instead. My grandmother passed away 3 years ago after a long illness. Since then, my grandfather had been living alone. He sold his old house and purchased a new one in the suburbs, slightly removed from the town. It was a convenient location for me as well. Unlike my mother, my grandfather understood my situation and genuinely cared for me. He was unaware of my mother, sister, and her boyfriend's attempts to pressure me into giving up my house after Andrew's death. When I arrived at his home with my belongings and explained everything, it was the first time he learned about the situation. To be honest, I had no intention of starting a fight. I simply wanted him to listen to my story with an open mind. I felt that giving up the house was my decision to make. I told my grandfather about my plans to move and asked if I could stay with him in the meantime. He listened to me and was visibly upset, saying he couldn't believe how insensitive my mother and sister had been. I thought that since I had willingly given up the house, it wasn't that big of an issue. My grandfather repeatedly said that their insensitivity and lack of concern for anyone but themselves was a serious issue. I hadn't fully thought through this situation. Because, for me, losing my husband felt like the most significant event of my life. And then I decided to take revenge on my sister and her boyfriend. This wasn't a rational decision, but simply a result of my anger toward them. First, I stopped paying the mortgage. When I consulted my grandfather, he understood my decision and advised, "It's no longer your house, so there's no need for you to continue paying." However, he did explain the impact it would have on my credit score. As expected, 2 months later, the bank sent a notice demanding payment. My sister and her boyfriend panicked at the unexpected situation, and my mother angrily called me. "How could you do this to your family?" But my resolve was firm. Why should I pay the mortgage for people who are illegally occupying my house? I answered calmly. As a result, they were forced to leave the house 3 months later. This incident left an irreparable rift in our family relationships, but I have no regrets. My credit score was indeed affected, but my grandfather offered to help with the down payment for a new house. Andrew would surely be proud of this decision. My grandfather encouraged me. I'm sure he would have wanted me to stand up for my rights. While my sister and mother continue to criticize me, many other relatives understand my position. Through this experience, I've learned that sometimes it's necessary to protect your own rights, even if it means hurting loved ones. Now, I live in a new house, cherishing the memories I have of Andrew and moving forward positively. Losing the house was a significant cost, but I feel that preserving my dignity was far more valuable. Moreover, my grandfather felt that it was time to teach them a lesson. The method he chose was to completely cut off financial support to my mother. As a result, it became clear that my mother had not only relied on my grandfather's money to raise us, but was still dependent on him for her living expenses. This was because she couldn't manage to cover her living costs on her own. I explained my mother's situation to my grandfather in detail. Afterward, he said he intended to take responsibility and deal with the matter, but I assumed he would simply talk to her directly. However, shortly after, I received countless messages from my mother and sister accusing me of being cruel and acting deliberately. So I asked my grandfather directly what he had done. He explained that everything he did was for my mother's benefit. We grew up with the support of our grandparents. My father, knowing he was sick and that he would pass away, left us some money before he died. Our grandparents did everything they could to support us and decided to protect us until we safely turned 18. It was a wise decision. Otherwise, I would have had to take care of my grandparents, and abandoning them would never have been an option. However, my grandfather felt that he had done enough for my mother and that it was time for her to start doing something for herself. My grandfather felt that if he didn't take action, my mother would become even more dependent on him, more assertive and increasingly callous. His decision was not wrong. In fact, what happened to me afterward proves it. Regarding my grandfather cutting off financial support to my mother and sister, I felt there was no particular problem, because I knew my grandfather had supported them for many years. However, my mother began tagging other family members on social media, spreading the idea that I had manipulated my grandfather to turn him against her and my sister, intending to exclude them. None of these claims were based on fact. My grandfather knew I hadn't done anything. This came entirely from his own sense of moral responsibility, and my mother and sister didn't see it as a particular issue. Their attacks on social media left me deeply troubled about how to deal with the hatred from my own family. Every time I saw the flood of messages, I wondered if I had made the wrong choice. When thinking about how to handle this, I considered that the best way might be to apologize to them and ask my grandfather to resume supporting them. However, I don't feel that would be appropriate or truly the right thing to do. Even so, I am unsure how to move forward from here. First and foremost, I gave up the house simply because I didn't want to fight with my family. It wasn't because I felt disrespected. I feel they need to understand that things don't always go the way they want. Looking back, if Andrew were still alive, I probably would have avoided this kind of conflict with my family. I felt disputes with my family weren't worth it. Some people may side with my mother, but my grandparents were different. When I was little, they always stood by me, supported my feelings, and even offered to let me live with them or stand against my mother if I wanted. My grandparents always did their best for me from a young age. However, my grandfather didn't tell me that he had been financially supporting my mother and sister until recently. This situation is somewhat complicated, influenced by the fact that my mother was their only child. As a child, my mother was quite spoiled by my grandparents. While they felt responsible for this, they didn't think much of it, assuming she would become independent as she grew up. However, their expectations were off, and my mother never became self-reliant. My grandparents tried in every way to help her become independent. Even so, they couldn't fully distance themselves from her or cut off financial support, as they were heavily dependent on her in some ways. My grandfather admitted that he felt he had been in a weak position and didn't know how to explain it, making it hard for him to say no to my mother. However, after the recent events involving me, he decided not to contact my mother directly to ask about the situation. While my mother did respond to them, nothing more came of it, and I have no intention of issuing a statement to defend myself. Honestly, I don't care about that anymore. I just wanted to feel a sense of healing in my heart. I want to cherish my own life. I have no desire to engage with people who spread rumors and claim their own righteousness meaninglessly. At first, I wrote that I wanted to live with my grandfather while working out of state, and that goal is progressing well. The commotion caused by the series of posts made by my mother and sister has also settled down, and I no longer hear from my family. This is thanks to the few people who spoke to me directly and understood the truth, then shared my story with others. Some people have apologized to me, while others haven't, but that's not important to me. In a few weeks, everything will be over, and I'd like to bring this chapter to a close. There are still a few people who, knowing I'm in a difficult situation, insist that I should have given up the house. It's been some time since I lost my husband, and during that time, many people have supported me and declared they would no longer speak to my mother or sister. I am truly grateful for their support. It brings me genuine joy to know that there are still people with the kindness to stand up for what is right. Of course, my grandfather has also been watching over my actions, repeatedly telling me how difficult it must have been to make those decisions. I just wanted to return home and find comfort in familiar surroundings, but the company that hired me offered a good salary, so I decided to work hard in a new place. Additionally, I wanted to keep myself busy with work to heal from what had happened and forget about the time. I stay in touch with friends, my grandfather and Andrew's parents, and I meet with them from time to time. Now, I feel proud of myself for working hard to build a better life for myself. I intend to achieve everything Andrew and I dreamed of together, and I will enjoy life to the fullest, even for the part Andrew couldn't experience. I will live a life that he would be proud of. I'm determined to do my very best,